LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom.
And I'm Caleb Bissinger.
And this is The Next Big Idea. Today, the delightful, disturbing, and downright fascinating story of the human mind.
Welcome back, Rufus. It's good to see you. I'm glad to have you back.
It's great to be back, Caleb. I miss you.
Right back at you. And, you're coming off vacation. You're hitting the ground running. I mean, you've got tomorrow, you're talking to the world's foremost expert on memory. This guy who's written a great new book called Why We Remember.
Can't wait for that one. And then next up, I think I'm talking to friend of the pod, Cal Newport, about his new book, Slow Productivity, The Lost Art of Accomplishment Without Burnout. Who doesn't want that? Which I've been dipping into and relishing slowly, appropriately.
I'm really looking forward to that one. I love Cal. Did I tell you, by the way, that I booked Eric Larson for the show?
Amazing. Amazing.
Yeah.
Wait, Devil Wears Prada?
Close. Devil in the White City is what he's best known for.
Devil in the White City. Yes.
Splendid in the Vile. I think he's written 6 New York Times bestsellers, and he's got a new book coming out called The Demon of Unrest.
Amazing. And you're going to interview him.
I am. Yeah, I claimed him for myself while you were on vacation.
Well done.
These are the kind of power trips I pull when you're, out of the office.
I'll tell you. We encourage insurrection. It's fantastic.
But enough about us. Why don't we talk about today's episode?
Yes. We have today a real treat, I think, for diehard fans of the show.
I think that's right. So this time last year, almost to the day, you recorded a conversation with Paul Bloom, who, for listeners who don't recognize that name, Paul is this incredibly eminent psychologist. He was tenured at Yale. I think he's now at University of Toronto. And he has this book that came out last year called Psych, which is kind of a survey of like the history of the field of psychology. And the two of you spoke last April, and I remember that conversation really well. First, because you recorded it on the day that I got engaged.
That wasn't very thoughtful of us.
Well, luckily someone else kindly stepped in to help engineer that episode. But I also remember it really well because it was super long. Like, I think the two of you spoke for like almost 2 hours. Yeah,
because I didn't have you browbeating me.
Yes, right. Normally I'm texting you like, wrap it up. Let's move on to Act 3. Like
land the airplane, Rufus.
Exactly. And right, I couldn't be bugging you, so you could just go. But that actually, Rufus, that's sort of, maybe we should share with listeners like kind of how that part of our recording and editing process works.
Yes. I think it's actually a wonderful thing to share. We typically take about 90 minutes of tape and cut it down to 60 minutes, ideally less than 60 minutes, a process that is excruciatingly painful for me and that you seem to get some kind of perverse pleasure out of, don't you, Caleb?
Yeah, I don't know what that says about me, but yes, like I do love to just figure out like how concise can we make this episode. But, I'll admit I do have a tendency to sometimes go too far. And as I reflect back on this Paul Bloom episode, there were a lot of great moments that just never saw the light of day. He's such a brilliant thinker. He's such a great talker that inevitably, if you're trying to take 2 hours of Paul Bloom and turn it into 1 hour of Paul Bloom, just some brilliant stuff gets lost.
I suspect you, Caleb, of intentionally, I'm just going to call you out on this. I suspect you of intentionally cutting back the tape further than you otherwise would because you know based on past experience that I'm going to be out there attempting mouth-to-mouth resuscitation of my favorite darlings and that we're probably going to end up with an extra 5 minutes of tape in the final edit.
Yeah, you're on to me. But Rufus, real quick, tell us why you loved this conversation with Paul so much and why we now feel it's worth sharing the whole director's cut with the audience.
Well, he's such a deep and fluent thinker about the human mind and the history of psychology and how we figured out what we have about how our minds work. And we got geeky about artificial intelligence and what we can learn about the human mind through the sort of coevolution of the minds that are these artificial minds we're building, the potential risks associated with that, and then got into sort of physics and free will, some of my favorite topics, which sometimes put you to sleep.
Yeah, they do. They do. But in this case, I'll allow it. So, no, it's a great conversation. I'm excited for folks to hear it. So why don't we take a quick break? And when we come back, we'll have the whole conversation between you and Paul Bloom.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by Medtronic. Medtronic is dedicated to the pursuit of life-transforming health tech. From AI to robotics and beyond, we're reinventing what's possible, and we're just getting started. Visit Medtronic.com to learn more.
Paul Bloom, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
It is great to talk to you. Looking forward to this.
Paul, you clearly have an infectious curiosity about the human mind, the field of psychology. You've been teaching an intro psychology class now at various universities for a couple decades, I think. And you're not bored of teaching the class, I understand. And now you've written a 400-page book called Psych, The Story of the Human Mind. Is your objective with this book to share this infectious curiosity about the human mind?
It is. It's I would never write a textbook. I wouldn't want to read a textbook, but I wanted to get down basically everything I know about the mind. This is a labor of love. It's everything I teach in my intro psych course, just much more detail. And I think it's really interesting stuff. I'm honest about the limitations of psychology, our failures, our embarrassments, what we struggle to explain. But I also get to talk about our discoveries, everything involving memory and language and mental illness and consciousness and reasoning, emotions, the whole shebang. And it was an enormous amount of fun to write.
Well, it's an enormous amount of fun to read. So that comes through. Let's start with one of your outrageous claims, which is that between our ears, we have this 3-pound wrinkly lump of meat in our skulls we call our brains. And you claim that these brains of ours give rise to all of our intelligence, all of our conscious experience. You admit that this is a shocking claim, even to you. Why is it shocking?
So I say a lot of radical things in my book. I make a lot of claims where I say this may not be true. People are debating this. This is controversial. But the idea that the brain is the source of mental life is entirely non-controversial in psychology. It's something which it's a notion which has developed over centuries, and now it is as close to there's enormous amount of evidence suggesting that as Marvin Minsky put it, we're machines made of meat. And so I talk about that. I talk about why we believe it. I talk about all the evidence that the brain is the source of intelligence and consciousness and so on. But at the same time, I acknowledge how shocking it is. It's not, we are, I think, common sense dualists. We naturally believe that we're separate from our brains. The idea that we're just physical things is shocking and upsetting. It calls into question religious ideas. It calls into question spiritual ideas. I think I have more respect for somebody who hears this and says, "Oh my God, that's horrible. You have to be wrong," than someone who says, "Oh, ho hum, whatever." It really is a radical idea.
It is astonishing, and as you say, it's belied by this physical experience, this mental experience we all have, that we're floating behind our eyes. Right. I mean,
yeah.
I mean, you say at one point that we feel like we occupy bodies rather than that we are bodies.
That's right. C.S. Lewis, I think, was the one who put it, said, you think you have a body, not you are a body.
Yeah.
And so when there's stories about people switching bodies or leaving their body, floating away from their body during dreaming, it makes sense. It's a very intuitive notion. And the idea that we are in some way inextricably bound to our physical selves because we are our physical selves is just doesn't feel right. I may not believe I could leave my body, just by choosing to through astral projection or reincarnation or whatever, but it does feel like very possible. And the science of psychology tells us probably really isn't.
Yeah, yeah. And when we fall asleep, we refer to it as drifting off, to sleep. And that's what it feels like, right? And so one can see why religions emerged. As you say, we're sort of natural-born dualists. We feel that we have a spirit that inhabits us. And we see this obviously reflected in all these religious beliefs, as you said, like the Hindus believe you might be reincarnated as a cricket or a goat or a monkey, depending on how well you've behaved, right? In the Judeo-Christian tradition, if we aren't naughty, we'll live forever in heaven, which is sort of vaguely described as a very nice place to be. And so it's not surprising to you that this has been the assumption that Homo sapiens have made for millennia. But it's, as you say, as a scientist, you're very humble in the book about what we can be certain of, or somewhat certain of, how high a degree of confidence we can have about various areas of various assertions of psychology. But this seems to be at the top of the list of things we're quite certain of because of a long history of experiments, right? Where we see that if you remove or damage a part of the brain, your personality fundamentally changes.
Right. So in some way, we've known this for a long time. Everybody knew that, alcohol can inflame the passions, that caffeine or drugs can affect in different ways. Everybody knew for the longest time that a sharp blow to the head could obliterate consciousness, that dementia or various diseases could mess up your capacity for reason and rationality. But the dualist intuition is strong. And so people tried to say, well, the soul is tethered to the brain in some way, and in some way damage to the brain affects the soul, but it still exists separately. And I think that notion has been whittled away over time. You go to a conference and people are talking about the most intimate aspect of yourself, maybe your sense of morality, which is something I'm very interested in. And people are arguing about where in the brain it is. And I don't actually find these discussions hugely interesting. I don't care where in the brain it is, but nobody is going to stand up and say, well, it's not in the brain at all. It's in the spiritual realm. Mm-hmm. Not because they're afraid of being ostracized or something, but because there's no evidence for it. You could get people to do moral judgments. You could look at what parts of the brain are activated, and you can, to varying degrees, develop a theory of how neurons wired together in very complicated ways can give rise to something like moral understanding and moral belief. I will say, in case this is going to sound too arrogant, that this, while we are extremely confident the brain is the source of mental life, and while we know a lot about how physical things can do intelligent things. Descartes could have been skeptical that a physical thing could play chess or carry on a conversation, but now we have machines to do just that.
Yeah.
So there's no doubting that mere physical machines could do intelligent things. The question of how consciousness, feeling, experience emerges from the brain is a really hard one. And I actually think that our field is struggling to explain it. We know that it's true, that that's where consciousness comes from. But how this happens is an enormous mystery.
Yeah. I love your riff about how people sometimes say that when they're describing some new educational or therapeutic intervention, it changes the brain.
Yeah.
And I think you cite like a New York Times article that's like, there's evidence that this, changes the brain. Well, as you point out, everything changes the brain, right? I mean, that every conversation, this conversation that you and I are having right now is changing our brains for both the two of us and everyone who's listening.
If you were hooked up to a brain scanner now and you were thinking of something and it didn't change your brain, it didn't manifest in the brain, that would be the discovery of all time. It would show dualism is correct, that there is thinking without physical activity in the brain.
Right.
But we're never going to find that because it's not true.
And it seems then that we have effectively like solid state drives to some degree, right? Because I think you say at one point that when we're knocked unconscious, we lose recent memories often that have not yet been encoded. But we don't lose our longer term memories, which would suggest that they've been encoded in some kind of solid physical manifestation in the brain. In fact, all mental life is such.
That's right. So short-term memory, your memory of the last sentence you said is just as much a physical event in the brain as a memory of, of your hometown. But there's a process called consolidation where the short-term memory turns into a long-term memory. It gets etched from one part of the brain to another. And, long-term memories we have an enormous capacity for memory. And you're right. You get smacked on the head, you get in a car accident or something, it could disrupt the consolidation process and memories can get lost forever.
Well, and this would also suggest that there's somewhat of a zero-sum game when it comes to memory, right? Because we just have the 3 pounds, give or take, right, of brain. We have our 86 billion neurons, give or take, and there's only so much space, and Paul, my wife says this about my closet. She says, Rufus, if you buy another pair of running shoes, you're going to have to throw a pair out. She thinks I have a running shoe fetish.
Well, that's another topic we could get to.
We can get to that later.
Get to fetishes.
But I was fascinated to learn. I think most of our listeners have probably heard the study of the London taxi drivers, right? They show the longer taxi drivers have been driving, the larger their hippocampus, which is apparently the location of spatial memory. But a more recent follow-up study, I think, showed that that those London taxi drivers who had particularly enlarged hippocampi were less good at remembering other things than a comparative set of bus drivers who did not have to memorize all of London. So I guess maybe the finiteness of the human brain helps to explain why we have such bad memories.
So the capacity, you're exactly right. The capacity of our memory has to be finite because our brains are physical things. So it's in principle possible to run out of space, and you have to start deleting stuff. Like, I had this old Mac a while ago, and whenever I added some stuff, I had to go delete old files. And it could be that the brain's that way. I saw an episode of the TV show Sherlock, where the character played by Benedict Cumberbatch insisted he didn't bother filling his head with irrelevant things. So let's leave room for what matters. I think it's a nice image. Nobody knows what the capacity of our brain is, and I don't think we ever get to the point of filling it. On the other hand, one of the findings of psychology, one of the shocking findings of psychology, and there are a few, is how bad our memories are. And I don't know I don't really think it's due to capacity limitation. I think it's more because people have the wrong idea of memory. People tend to think memory is like, I'm holding up my iPhone and recording a scene, and then it's on the memory of the iPhone. And then you get back your memories, just recover the video. And forgetting under this view is just not being able to access the memory. But if you had a good psychiatrist or you thought really hard, you could access it. And
right. So it could, in some cases, it's a retrieval problem.
That's right. And people who study memory say this picture is really mistaken. Remembering something is much more of a reconstructive event.
Yes.
And so it is. So it's reconstructed. It's your best guess as to what happens, and your guess could be helped along by your suppositions of what should have happened, your memory of stories that you told before, even memories that are extremely vivid. You swear on your life it really happened, turn out to be often dramatically false.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? There's an irony there because our most deeply encoded memories, our favorite memories, we've reconstructed probably more times, right? Or like we have a certain set of stories we like to tell or memories we like to share. And I feel this about some of my favorite memories, that I've told the story so many times that I actually have no access to the
all you have is access to the stories you told. And that is ironic. Our most important memories tend to be the most corrupted. Right. And this is how I think our brains, I think there's a useful analogy to our brains and computers, but if I access an MS Word file over and over again, it doesn't change the file. But our memories, but accessing real life memories in our brains does change it. There was a study actually done by some colleagues at Yale, where right after the terrorist attacks of 9/11 happened, she asked people, where were you when you heard about them? And they told her. And then she asked, I forget how many years later, where were you when you heard about it? And he said, I know exactly why. And they told a story, and the story was wrong. And that, as you point out, that's the irony, because that's the sort of thing you tell people, you talk about it. Before you know it, you're remembering your wife's story. You're remembering, we simplify stories, you're remembering the simplified version.
Well, and so what becomes extraordinary then? I mean, so I guess it's somewhat reassuring to know that each of us does not happen to be the only person who has a very faulty memory.
Yeah.
It's like, this is a universal human condition. You cite the example of Hillary Clinton, who said, I think in 2008, that she had landed in Bosnia in a helicopter under heavy fire. And then the video showed that that was not the case. And people said, this is outrageous. She's a psycho,
She's
whatever.
a psycho. She has dementia. She has, being totally unaware that if I asked you about your last trip outside the country, about anything, you would get a lot of it wrong. And I would get a lot of it wrong too. And our memories are typically terrible. And we know this now because we have technologies that record things that don't get it wrong. And then you could go back to the tape. I don't know if you've ever been in a marital argument which turned on the issue of saying, no, you said that to me first. No, I didn't say that. You got it totally wrong. And, and if you could go back to the tape, and it sounds like horrible marital advice to have a video camera constantly running in your living room. But it would turn out you're probably both wrong.
Yeah. And by the way, I think all of us who are married have at some time really pined for that, wished we had that tape, right? You're like, I know that my recollection of this is right. How could you not know?
Eric, I wish I could show you what happened. How do you get things so wrong? I mean, another sort of thing about being married is that I tell a story in my book, which is I was at a party and I told a very funny story of something which happened to me, and very sincere. And then I was on the way home because my wife was very kind. She said, that happened to me. And I said, really? Yeah. I told a story a while ago and you just took it as your own story. And that happens. Couples tend to share memories and sometimes you forget where you get them from.
And so what are the takeaways of this? I mean, obviously it's we clearly need to be more humble, right? Yeah. And in our relationships, as you're saying, we give each other the benefit of the doubt. Don't be overconfident. I guess there are legal implications as well, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to be cautious about the implications. I think a lot of psychology is really interesting and doesn't have many practical implications. Just interesting to know about the mind. This does. The work on the fragility of memory and unreliability of memory, much done by the psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, has led to a revolution in the legal system. It used to be, somebody's on a witness stand and they point and they said, that was the man who shot me. And everyone gasps and says, and that's it. That's with the confidence, the clarity of it. It seems irrefutable. And there's been so many cases now of DNA evidence and video evidence that sometimes somebody could totally believe that it was this person, not that person, happened here and not there. But be wrong. And now I think they've changed policies for how you do lineups and how you do photo identification. There's also cases where people have confessed to crimes that they didn't commit.
Right. This is astonishing.
That is astonishing. I mean, there's been some very famous, and it seems unbelievable. If you had me on tape saying, "Oh, I murdered this person," well, I could be lying, but how could I be mistaken about something so significant? It turns out that under pressure, people, particularly, and not everybody, but some people are more malleable than others, can be pushed. Sometimes, without any ill intent. Sometimes just, I know the guy did it. I'm just going to yell at him for a while till he fesses up, and you could create a false memory in somebody. And so the legal systems become a bit sensitive to that as well.
It's humbling to understand how porous and imperfect our memories are. I used to think my memory was a bucket, and now I realize it's a colander.
Yes.
And I think as you get older, you become more aware of that. But but I guess there must be some efficiency to this. There's a parsimoniousness to what the brain is doing. Because I remember reading at one point that we have this illusion that our entire visual field we see with perfect clarity. But when you're, say, looking at a road sign and you can read perfectly what's on the road sign, that your brain is focusing on that spot, and all the other areas of your visual field are actually more blurry.
Yeah.
But you have the illusion that you see everything in your visual field with perfect clarity. And it seems to me that this is quite analogous to the illusion we have that we have these perfect memories of our childhoods and our past. But in both cases, it's efficient, right? It's a parsimonious use of the available mental horsepower.
It is. So sometimes our limitations come out because, like you say, we have limited mental horsepower. Attention is the example you're giving is a great one. There's a classic demonstration, which had a whole book built around it called Invisible Gorilla, where you get people in this demonstration, and I'm sure many people listening to this have seen this before. People are asked to watch a scene where a bunch of students are tossing basketballs to each other and asked to count how many times the basketballs are tossed. And then when it's over, they're said, so how many tosses did you see? And they give an answer. But what many of them don't notice is in the middle of the scene, somebody dressed up in a gorilla suit walks over, pounds his chest, and walks away. And if you're just looking at it, it's the most obvious thing in the world. But if you're focusing on something else, it becomes invisible. And so a lot of our limitations, say, in vision, and a lot of real life car accidents happen because when we're not attending to something, it becomes invisible to us. The issues with memory are a bit more complicated. So some people might argue that memory is not built to construct a sort of perfectly accurate perception. It's built to capture generalizations and sort of to do. It's not perfect. Truth is not what it's really wired up for.
Yeah. Well, we talked earlier about this sensation we all have of floating in our skulls. And we've now been talking about the impermanence of our memories, this porousness of memories, this kind of drifting cloud-like, experience of our past. It reminds me of the Milan Kundera line describing the unbearable lightness of being, which I think you could just as easily call the delightful lightness of being. Right? I mean, people talk about existential angst, which I can relate with, but I think it's equally sensible to talk about existential euphoria, like we exist. Isn't that remarkable? But it gets to this question of why, of the miracle of consciousness. How did consciousness emerge in the first place? Why is it necessary to be aware of being aware? And of course, philosopher David Chalmers, who we had on the show, talks about this as the hard problem of consciousness. Do you see it as a hard problem?
Yeah, I do. I think that there are, and David Chalmers, admits this, different forms, different things we mean when we talk about consciousness. So one sort of consciousness is the philosopher Ned Block talks about access consciousness, and that's just you're conscious of something if you get to report it. So right now I'm not conscious of my blood pressure. I can't tell you what my blood pressure is, but I am conscious of the sound of your voice. So I could talk about it and I could remember and I could think about it. There's that sense of consciousness which you could program into a computer, and it's more of a sort of informational thing. But then there's consciousness in the Chalmers sense, phenomenological consciousness, which is, what it feels like. What it feels like, I don't know, to hold your newborn, to slam your hand in a car door, to eat ice cream. And there's something which is sort of ineffable about it. And it's not only mysterious how the brain gives rise to it or why the brain gives rise to it. It's also of some moral significance. So we are living in a world now, with many fellow creatures, animals, and the extent to which they have experiences, I think, bears on the morality of how we treat them. And now we're creating more and more, I don't know whether to call them creatures, but intelligences. Mm-hmm. And this guy, Blake Lemon, I think, this Google engineer, about a year ago, ended up worrying that the chatbot he was working with was sentient, was conscious. Yeah. And then he complained to his bosses. And he said, well, if it's conscious, it's a slave. We gotta let it free. So they put him on leave. And there was a lot of people who mocked him. But I think he was, or he is, a canary in a coal mine, in that this is going to become more and more common as the chatbots, as these AIs become smarter and smarter and smarter. Sooner or later, pretty much everybody's going to say, wow, that's a consciousness. Now, the problem is, just like you can't know for sure that I'm conscious, you kind of infer it. We can't know for sure what is and what isn't conscious, but it matters.
Yeah, well, of course, this is it's just an extraordinary moment, isn't it? Because, for decades, people have been debating what the utility of consciousness is, why it's emerged. I think Chalmers coined the hard problem of consciousness some like 20 plus years ago. Yeah. And there have been, a camp that felt that it was substrate dependent, meaning that it has to emerge out of, our soft, brains opposed to silicon. And I've always loved Antonio Damasio's explanation, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Damasio and his who studied the evolution of feelings, and his assertion, which I think is fascinating. We had him on the show, is that feeling preceded cognition and was a prerequisite for consciousness, because we're these fragile creatures that evolved very quickly to begin to have these sensations of pain and pleasure to try to navigate the world. And that sensation, results in a feeling of being inside your body. And that was a necessary prerequisite for developing this experience of consciousness. That always made sense to me. But now we're really doing the experiment in real time of seeing whether consciousness or some kind of sentience can emerge on silicon. And just a week or two ago, some Microsoft researchers published a paper called Sparks of Artificial General Intelligence, Early Experiments with GPT-4, that said that one of these early sparks they reported of emergent AGI was a capacity for theory of mind.
Yeah.
So it feels like my sense has been everybody. It's fashionable to scoff at people who say that sentience may be beginning to emerge. But my view has always been we don't understand the emergence of consciousness in humans, right? So how can we be so certain as to exactly when and how it could emerge?
Yeah, there's two really hard, very pressing questions here, and one is sort of it's something which we're going to get a handle on, which is how smart will these machines get? And I'll tell you, just try and maybe to set up to try to encourage the public policy of people admitting that they were wrong. I could not have imagined that there would be machines like Bing or ChatGPT. If you asked me 2 years ago, I would have said, we'll get them in 50 years, maybe.
Yeah.
And now we have them. And like a lot of people, I'm just shocked at how quickly we got them and how smart they are. I spend a lot of time playing with them. And yes, you can get them to mess up. They hallucinate. They have limitations. My friend Gary Marcus is very smart over what these machines can't do. But still, it's so shockingly smart. So that's one issue. Will they reach a point where they don't get any smarter? Or will they get to a point where there's artificial general intelligence and they're smarter than us in every possible way? Their relationship to you and me will be like our relationship to a 3-year-old. So that's question one.
Yeah.
And that will kind of know when it happens, I think. But then question two is the consciousness question. So maybe Damasio's right.
Yes.
Maybe we'll be dealing with a machine that could think rings around us, that can talk, can persuade us, that can figure out exactly how our minds work, but there's nothing inside. It's just a bunch of connections, of statistics, and it has no experience. But how would we know?
Yes, exactly. Well, there's a new book out from a theoretical psychologist called Nick Humphrey called Sentience, the Invention of Consciousness. And he has a theory that sort of dovetails with what has always been my intuition, which is that he says, well, sentience was obviously a biological trait that arose through natural selection. And among social apes, it was a great advantage to be able to read people's minds, to predict the behavior of other apes. And so we had to create, this theory of mind, this model of other people's motivations and personalities. And if you can be better at predicting how other humans are going to behave, you have a great advantage in an environment in a highly collaborative environment, in a highly social species. And the best way to do this is to understand our own motivations and have a theory of mind that applies to ourselves, understand ourselves so we can put ourselves in the shoes of others. And that this process, a theory of other minds, and then by reflected back to us a theory of our own mind, resulted in the emergence of conscious experience. So it's an interesting argument. It's a hypothesis effectively. But what's astonishing is we're starting to see something like this with ChatGPT-4. And there was a fascinating post recently by Robert Wright, the wonderful author who wrote Non-Zero and the Moral Animal, I'm sure you're familiar with,
Yep.
who's working on a book about cognitive empathy, who had been testing GPT-4 with lots of very complex questions about reading all the motives of a collection of humans in a given situation and understanding their various perspectives. And he was just astonished by the sophistication of GPT-4 and believes that it has developed a kind of cognitive empathy. So this is what's interesting is we're starting to see. I think the Microsoft researchers themselves, who obviously have a partnership with OpenAI, have said that we're watching intelligence emerge not unlike the emergence of human capabilities from a young age. The theory of mind emerges in children, I think, at some age, right?
And in some way, that sort of provides a test or a challenge to Humphrey's theory. So I'm a big fan of Bob Wright and his thoughts about cognitive empathy. And if I remember right, his example is something like one of his examples he uses somebody. This may be somebody else, but the example is somebody embarrasses himself, and how does he feel after he makes a stupid mistake? How does the person whose friend feels? Suppose he's trying to impress this girl, but you like the girl. How do you feel to watch him embarrass himself in front of her? And the machine, the ChatGPT, is pretty smart about this.
Yeah.
So Humphrey might then say that, well, maybe in order to be this smart at it, it has to be able to feel these emotions itself. But are we going to already go to the claim that it feels embarrassment and satisfaction and shame and delight and sympathy? I don't know. I don't feel I'm ready to go there quite yet. In part, and this is actually David Chalmers has spoken about this before, in part because at this point the large language models are untethered to the physical world. They're just, no, I don't want to say just, but they work through prediction of what word will follow another word,
right,
and a lot more than that, but that kind of thing. But they don't have motor control. They don't act on the world. They don't perceive the world. Maybe once we get that, So let me ask you something, because I just heard a discussion by Eric Hole and a neuroscientist and Russ Roberts, and this was turning over the issue of whether there should be a moratorium on AI research.
Yes,
that we should shut it down for a while because there's a huge threat, as we do with research into biological weapons and nuclear weapons and so on. It is getting to a point where we don't know where it's going. Do you have any sympathy for doing that?
I personally do. Yeah, we had a recent conversation with Kevin Roos.
Yeah.
Who the New York Times reporter, with whom Sydney, also known as GPT-4, fell in love.
Yeah, tried to break up his marriage.
Tried to disrupt his marriage. And I'm of the opinion that and this is, I think, is an emergent view. We recently had a letter from a collection of people in the industry calling for a kind of a pause.
Yeah.
And I'm of the opinion that we should err on the side of caution here. And it's, we also, in that episode, a conversation with Kevin Roos, I was not reassured to hear, Sam Altman, who runs OpenAI, which appears to be the furthest ahead with GPT-4, although Google is maybe neck and neck, saying the only condition that concerns him is a race environment.
Yeah.
Right. And that's precisely what we're experiencing right now, right? Between Google and OpenAI, and Lord knows what the Chinese are doing. So this does feel to me, I'm generally have been someone who is less alarmist than most people and says, oh, this will work out, this will be okay. And I find myself in the unusual position of feeling more alarmist than most people I know.
Yeah, I've been listening to a lot of people who I respect who are pretty smart, and they're very, very worried, and I've started to get worried with them. In some way, we could talk about it the way the rationalists talk about it and say, what are the odds that AI, unfettered, keeps developing and something terrible comes from it. And, and if you think the odds are very small, but they're like 5%, well, that's for the destruction of our species. That's quite a worrying percentage. So I don't know.
Unacceptably high. Yeah,
unacceptably high. And I don't know. One response to it is that if American companies or European companies stop, there'll still be other countries like China proceeding. So
yes,
this is the concern. You want to have some sort of treaty where everybody stops.
Right. It could prove to be a moment in the coming years for a global. I mean, much as we have had historically with nuclear weapons, right? That it's a time when the world makes efforts to come together, and hopefully we'll see that. But returning to the somewhat lighter and delightful topic of what we can learn about ourselves through this process, which is, I mean, of course, one hat I'm wearing watching all this is just one of utter fascination, right? And I would think, for you as a psychologist, having studied, consciousness in the human mind for so many years, it's impossible not to feel a sense of rapture and fascination with what's happening at the same time that one alternately says, whoa, wait a second, let's be careful. But in these moments when people say, hey, this is just a glorified prediction machine. It's just guessing the next word in the sentence, or maybe it's now predicting the next chapter in the book.
Yeah.
To me, the next question is, well, wait a second. Maybe we are glorified prediction machines. People say, oh, well, they don't have volition. AI doesn't have a sense of volition or a sense of free will. Well, there are a lot of neuroscientists and physicists, a lot of top neuroscientists and physicists who are not sure that we have free will, right? So it's a kind of a fascinating moment where we're asking questions of this emergent intelligence that we also could reasonably ask of ourselves.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's sort of a poor argument that goes, well, they're just stochastic parrots, so why worry about them? I mean, in some way, we're just, neurons firing. Why worry about that? And the answer is that sometimes you could have a simple process that gives rise to something quite complicated and potentially malevolent. I think there's a really good debate to be had over whether or not the sort of deep learning, that predictive action that these things like ChatGPT do, is in fact how people think. So plainly, you could do remarkably far with these machines, but then again, human children aren't exposed to this enormous data set, and yet they learn to talk and they learn to reason. And people have pointed out that these machines are glitchy in certain ways. So again, Gary Marcus has some really impressive demonstrations that because they do it, they don't have rules in the head. They don't have models of the world. They're just, predictors. You could make them glitch in some surprising ways. And they hallucinate and they have all sorts of problems. They have problems that humans don't have. We have our share, but they make different kinds of errors. And so it's possible that it just doesn't overthrow other theories of psychology. It just shows that there's more than one way to be smart.
Yes, certainly. Yeah, intelligence is plural. And so when it comes to the question of free will, you describe yourself as a compatibilist. But I think, would you allow that there's cause for debate here? I mean, I think my understanding is among neuroscientists and physicists and such that there's a pretty healthy difference of opinion on this topic.
Yeah. So it seems that there's two views on the table. One view is sort of view which I hold, which is compatibilism, which is the idea that, we live in a determined universe, maybe some randomness. A smart enough God, a smart enough physicist could predict what you're going to say, what you're going to do next. And it doesn't seem like you have any free will in that sense. But then again, we do make decisions. There's a difference between choosing and being coerced. There's a difference between weighing your options and flipping a coin. And we should call that free will. But while still accepting that in a different sense it's determined. That's compatibilism. Daniel Dennett has a nice example where he says that, physicists have shown that much of what we believe about time is mistaken. But you don't go on and say, well, time doesn't exist. What you say is, oh, time exists. We just got some things wrong. I think the same thing is for free will. The other view is to just go full, say there's no such thing as free will. And we have to live without it. There's a third view, which I don't think people take because it's not very realistic, which is there really is a sense in which we can transcend the causal forces of the physical world, where we are not subject to physical law. We could escape it. And I don't find that a very serious view.
Yeah. Well, I'm pleased with your answer to that question because I've been more in the Sam Harris camp of believing that I just find it very, very hard to explain how and why we would have free will given what I understand about sort of science and 14 billion years of evolution, swirling rocks, chemical reactions, this sort of chain of causality, even if it's an imperfect chain of causality and there's indeterminacy on a very small level, it's very hard for me to understand how that subatomic indeterminacy could organize itself into the will of Rufus or Paul.
That's right. That's right. And if it did, what would it even mean for it to choose for it to be neither determined nor random?
I mean, it feels a little bit to me like this question of to what extent does what we want to believe influence what we come to believe? Yeah. Right. And there's individual confirmation bias, and then there's sort of society-wide confirmation bias. And we've had sort of, first we thought, God created man in his image and we get to live forever. Those are things that are nice to believe. And then we sort of, as we surrender some of that, we thought the earth was the center of the universe. And then, we've gradually been, surrendering our specialness, our centrality incrementally. And to me, that's the next logical step. But I'm very happy to be not fully certain of this. And so I'm buoyed by your perspective because we had an interesting conversation with Sam Harris on this topic. He has, I think, a lovely optimistic view that if you believe that there's no free will, it actually can give you a positive kind of view of the world because it's impossible to hate anyone if in a world without free will, but it's not impossible to love is the position he takes. I think it is difficult to admire humans.
Yes.
Right, in the absence of free will. So that's my pushback on Sam.
I have a similar pushback. I think that if you give up free will, which I don't, I think there's a sense in which we do make choices and so on, granting determinism. But if you give it up fully, yes, you can't hate somebody because what they did was, if you were in the same position, you would have done exactly the same thing. How could it be otherwise? But you also can't be grateful for anybody. You can't admire them. You can't respect them.
Yeah.
To the extent that your love isn't a just reflexive love, but your love has to do with how somebody acts towards you or how somebody is, then loving one person it's like they had no choice in the matter.
Yes.
And so how does that merit love?
Right. It's not a particularly special love or love infused with admiration.
When we come back, we lighten things up by talking about the naughty father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by Medtronic. Medtronic is dedicated to the pursuit of life-transforming healthcare technology. From artificial intelligence to robotics and beyond, health tech is reinventing what's possible. Every year, Medtronic improves the lives of 74 million people, and we're just getting started. Visit Medtronic.com to learn more.
I want to quickly tell you about the Next Big Idea Club's BookBox subscription. Every quarter, we get our friends Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink to pick the 2 best new works of nonfiction. And then we send them to our subscribers. If you sign up, you'll also get access to beautiful audio and video e-courses, invitations to exclusive AMAs with top authors, membership in our LinkedIn community, and VIP access to our live events. Plus, you'll be helping us continue to make this show. So if this is at all interesting to you, go to nextbigideaclub.com, learn more, and if you do end up subscribing, use the promo code PODCAST at checkout to get 20% off. That's nextbigideaclub.com, promo code PODCAST.
to lighten things up a bit, let's talk about Sigmund Freud.
It's funny because you gave kind of a little riff, and I think maybe inadvertently you quoted Freud. So what Freud was saying, Freud was boasting about his psychoanalytic theory as Freud was prone to. He said, we've gone through 3 revolutions. And one revolution is that we discovered we're not centered in the universe. The second revolution is Darwin's revolution, that we have been created by the same forces that created rats and dogs and cockroaches. But the third revolution, and now he says, this one's mine, he said, although he credited other people. But the third revolution is that we are not masters of our own fate. And he wasn't talking there about free will in general. He was talking about the conscious. He was saying that basically his central view, I think the thing which he got most right, is that a lot of our actions and our responses and our thoughts and our decisions are generated by forces that are out of our conscious control.
So Freud is such an interesting figure. And growing up, I should say my mother was a psychoanalyst, so she had a reverence for Freud, of course. And my experience growing up in the 80s in high school was that Freud was sort of thought of as one of the 3 or 4 most revolutionary thinkers of the last couple centuries, not only in Freud's own mind, but more broadly, right? That there was Darwin, there was Freud, maybe Marx, Einstein, these people whose thinking really changed the world. And he was a heavyweight. I don't think I've seen a major thinker lose credibility as dramatically as Freud has in the last several decades.
Freud
right?
has had a significant fall from grace. I'm reading from a review right now. I have this in front of me. I just pulled it up. It's by a biography of Freud by Frederick Crews, and it summarizes the idea, Crews's depiction of Freud, as liar, cheat, incestuous child molester, woman hater, money worshiper, chronic plagiarist, and all-around nasty nut job. And so
Wow.
Freud has had
that disgrace.
Yes,
yeah,
and I'm very explicit about this, which is I teach Freud in my intro psych class, but not everybody does. And you can get a degree in psychology at a great university without ever hearing his name ever spoken. And
that's amazing.
That's not entirely mistaken. It's people. He got just about everything in the details wrong. His claims about the anal stage, the oral stage, the primal scene, penis envy, Oedipus complex.
Nothing.
I don't think there's any of the specifics stand up to scrutiny.
Yeah.
And
I'm sorry, I don't know, but how about the detail that a man who smooths the crease of his trousers in place before lying down on the couch reveals himself to be a coprophiliac, someone obsessed with their feces.
Yeah,
right.
he was very quick to judge. You could say,
right. And as you pointed out, if you deny it, well, you're obviously confessing, and if you don't deny it, you're agreeing, right?
So I grant all of that. But I actually think Freud belongs in my book, and I think he belongs in training of a psychologist, and belongs. I think there's a few reasons. One thing is simply his historical prominence.
Yes.
We all kind of live in a world that was partially created by Freud. If you ever describe somebody as having an anal personality, or say to somebody, "I'm not your mother," you're channeling Freud, whether you know it or not. So you should know it. I think Freud was a wonderful writer. I think he often had some extraordinary insights. For me, and this goes back to what you were saying earlier, I think Freud's great accomplishment was he really did build a science of the mind based on the idea of a dynamic unconscious. And everything else has got sort of jettisoned away, but the notion that we don't know why we do what we do has remained. And I think is right, and I think is important. I have friends who are political psychologists, and they would say, "Hey, I wonder why people voted for Biden or voted for Trump." And they don't just ask people, not because they're worried that they get lied to. There's always that, but because they accept, just as the basic axiom, people might not know. You have to go deep.
Yeah, and was this not? I mean, certainly there were references in poetry and literature and so on to this notion that people have desires and the unconscious was to some degree understood vaguely before Freud. But your view would be that he was pretty critical to helping the whole world understand more broadly that there's so much of what we think and feel that's inaccessible to our conscious minds.
That's right. Even Freud himself, who was not, who was very quick to take credit for everything, conceded that the notion of an unconscious was around long before him. Apparently, according to literary critic Harold Bloom, it was Shakespeare had tons of it.
Sure,
notions
sure.
Of unconscious motivations and unconscious drives. But like you say, I think Freud tried to build a psychology out of it. And even though he got everything wrong, it was the right general idea. I have a lot more. I have a chapter on Skinner too, and I think there's a lot to learn from Skinner. But I have a lot more love for Freud than for Skinner. Yeah.
Well, he's more lovable. And there's also, as you say, I'm quoting you here, something liberating about his openness to sexuality. And you say, I love this line: "If everyone is a pervert, perhaps nobody is a pervert."
Thank you. I'm very fond of that line. I find writing so hard, but I wrote that line and I kind of chuckle. Oh, that's really clever. Well, I hope one day somebody will quote it back to me. So I'm very happy.
It's great news for perverts everywhere, which Freud would say is all of us. Yes.
So Freud was, I think Freud clearly overemphasized sex. I mean, he couldn't. It was everywhere for Freud, everywhere and everything. But everyone else was underemphasizing it.
Yes.
Freud would talk quite candidly about the sexual desires of women, which was not a thing among his contemporaries. It was shocking to his contemporaries. He would talk about and he would basically argue your sort of average person is filled with desires which one might call perverted. And there's something, I do think there's something liberating about that for people who are sexual minorities of some sort or another, to realize that they're just one set of perverts among many.
Yeah. Well, and when you think too that, of course, Freud was advancing these theories in the Victorian era, which was much more repressed than our own era, although, it must have been really heterodox thinking back then. But even today, I think one could say that we're still a somewhat repressed culture. Whatever your persuasion is, there's it's liberating to be told that it's normal to feel uncomfortable with one's own, sexual urges or whatever. That's part of what he's left us, which is this sort of some degree of liberation.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I think that I'm not going to be so counterintuitive to deny that they were more repressed back in Victorian era than right now. But there's taboos right now. There's a lot of taboos around sex, around politics, around race, and maybe some degree of society which has tabooed a very Freudian ideas. That's part of health. That's part of a healthy society. Not everything that the id sends out should be confronted by the ego.
Right. And I think I remember, I want to go back and reread Civilization and Its Discontents, which I remember just loving back in college. But didn't Freud have this view that so much of human progress was a result of our kind of struggling with and suppressing sexual urges, that this was a catalyst in effect, right?
I think that's right. It actually is one of my favorite, I think that my favorite book of Freud. It's been so long since I read it. But that sounds like a very Freudian idea.
Well, my mother, a retired psychoanalyst, will be delighted that we found a few nice things to say about Freud in the conversation.
It's unusual these days, but yeah.
There's a great question to be posed about what the utility of unconscious thoughts are from an evolutionary perspective. Like, why would we evolve as creatures that have unconscious thoughts that we're not consciously aware of? And there's this wonderful section. I'd never really known how to think about that. And you refer to the evolutionary biologist Robert Trivers, who has an interesting possible explanation.
Yeah, Trivers is in many ways a genius. He pops up in my book here and there with some clever idea or another. The standard version of the standard theory of the origin of the unconscious is what we were talking about before, just capacity limitations. You can't be conscious of everything. So you put a podcast on and that's great. But if you put one podcast in one ear and a different podcast in another ear. You can't listen to them both. But if you're focusing on one of them, you're monitoring the others unconsciously. So if all of a sudden somebody said your name, you might turn and say, "Oh my gosh, somebody said my name." You'll notice it. So, but there's just so much we can take in. But Trivers had a different idea. Trivers said, in some ways, having your things be unconscious actually has a benefit, and he targeted the benefit in terms of deception. So the best way to deceive somebody, and often we need to deceive others, the best way to deceive somebody is to deceive yourself so you can't give it away. So if you're in a confrontation, it might, and you want to convince the other person you will not back down no matter what, even if in fact you would back down, it is best to believe for the moment that you wouldn't back down. If you want to persuade somebody you're head over heels in love with them, the best tactic is to be head over heels in love with them and have your hesitation and your maybe not be not available to your consciousnly. It's as if when we're playing, if you and I are playing poker and my emotions just spill out, it would be quite a gift after I make my bet to forget what my hand was and not be conscious of it. Therefore, I can't reveal it.
Right. Exactly right. Well, you have a wonderful metaphor in the book, which is if a rabbit is running away from a predator and it's trying to run in random directions, if it consciously knows what its evasive actions will be in the future, it may inadvertently signal that it's about to take a hard right with its posture, causing it to die. Right?
Yes, I think that's from. Right. I think it's from Dan Dennett and the philosopher Dan Dennett, and it's funny because my next, I'm very interested in perverse actions.
Yeah.
Maybe I think this is probably my next writing project. And
wonderful.
And there's different motivations for perverse actions, but one is if you could be unpredictable, there are certain situations where that gives you a huge advantage. But the best sort of unpredictability is you're even unpredictable to yourself.
I remember reading that, economists who have a relatively cynical, seem to have a relatively cynical view of human nature, had this question about why anyone would give a generous tip if other people aren't watching them do so. Right, that there's a rational, from a game theory perspective, like it is useful for us to show people around us that we are generous and selfless. So giving a big tip in front of other people makes total rational sense. But if no one's looking, it's not rational at all, unless you're trying to convince yourself that you are generous. Right. So you have a conscious perception of yourself as this incredibly sort of generous, thoughtful person, whereas unconsciously maybe you're a little more selfish.
I like that story. I think that often economists suffer from a too narrow list of our motivations. So you might give a tip just because it's custom, and we often instinctively fall back on custom. You might give a tip because you feel it's the right thing to do, and I think that can be a motivation. But I like your point, which is sometimes you try to sort of nurture you try to kind of work on your own CV. In a sense that you do things and you kind of write them up in your head and you try to have it really like to show yourself to be a kind or moral or interesting person. There are times in one's life where people say something like, "I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do the right thing at that point." And often these times are private. There's nobody else watching you, but you want to have a good impression of yourself. And maybe to bring things back a bit, I think that the chatbots are a good deal away from that level of psychology.
Let's talk about mental disorders, and of course, the study of psychology for most of its history, I think, has been focused on mental disorders, opposed to positive psychology or human flourishing. That's a more recent interest, right? But we've really been trying to address the deep pain and dysfunction that a subset of the population experiences. I was really surprised to read in your book that the former director of the National Institute of Mental Health recently said no new drug targets or therapeutic mechanisms of real consequence have been developed for more than 4 decades. So it seems like we've been maybe a little stuck when it comes to making progress on treating serious mental disorders.
Yeah. I have a friend of mine. If I tell people I'm a psychologist, which I used to tell people, they assume I'm a clinician, and they'll tell me about their dreams or their troubled adolescence or something. Yeah. And most of psychology is about phenomena of mental life and has nothing to do with mental illness. But clinical psychology is important. It's important. It's a central part of our field. People aren't wrong to assume, psychologists, you must be a therapist or a shrink of some sort. And I think it's really important. And I try to be candid in the book about the problems of psychology. We've gone through a replication crisis, which is quite serious, affecting social psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive psychology. But clinical has its own problem, which is, and I know when I say this, there's going to be, 100 responses say, no, you're forgetting about this discovery and this theory. But on the whole, that quote you read is right. I don't think we've made a huge amount of progress in the last few decades. Our drugs are not demonstratively better than they were a while ago. Our talk therapy is kind of like if you were seeing a therapist in 1990, it wouldn't be so different from seeing a therapist now. And I'm not sure why this is so. I kind of know why it's so for the drugs, which has to do with financial incentives. People have written about this. It's just very expensive to develop a new drug. So it's much better to simply take an old drug, tweak it, give it a new name and market it, rather than try something totally new. What some people will say, and I hope they're right, is that revolution is just around the corner. Maybe it's I know a lot of people raise this. Maybe it's psychedelics. Maybe a little bit of LSD as part of therapy will have tremendous effects. Maybe it's some sort of brain stimulation, little electric shocks and mild electric shocks in the right area make your depression go away. Maybe it's mindfulness, though I think that's currently being used a lot and is of some use, but not a revolution. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I hope it is. I mean, I'll also say that, as I'm very much stressed in the book, that our best evidence suggests therapy and drugs do work. They're better than not doing them.
Yeah. And you say that all disorders exist on a continuum, and this has implications for neurodiversity. That's interesting to me. How so?
So there's a big debate over whether disorders are categorical or continuous. So,
right.
And I wouldn't say all disorders. I think there are some which really are. Parkinson's. You could vary in intensity,
sure.
But it's not like we all have. It's not like it's a smooth gradient from normal to Parkinson's or normal to other things. Some things sort of stand out as separate categories, but the idea here is that that when you think about anxiety or depression, the two main disorders actually, but you make the same case for schizophrenia. There's a temptation to see it as something you have or you don't. And when you have it could be more or less intense, but you have or you don't. And it's like COVID. You get tested for COVID. And nobody says, it's a matter of degree. Everybody has a little bit of COVID. No, you either have it or you don't, more or less. And the claim for anxiety and depression is it's on a continuum. There are people who are very cheerful, and there are people who are sad, and there are people who are sadder. And at a certain point, you say that's a disorder. And the issue of neurodiversity comes in because the point at which you say that's a disorder isn't so much a sort of scientific question. It's a practical one. It's a moral one. It's a political one. There are some people who on the extremes who say there's no such thing as mental illness. This is a stigmatizing term. Society should change to make the world better for people who are different. And I think in the extreme version, that's nonsense. You see somebody who has schizophrenia, who has severe depression, who has a social phobia, they can't leave the house. These people are living in misery. And I think something like severe schizophrenia, severe depression should be thought of as akin to cancer, which is you want to cure it. You want to make people's lives as good as possible. You want to cure it. But there is a question of where you do the cutoff, and where I'm sort of on board of neurodiversity is sometimes I think we are not. I think sometimes society should change in order to make things better for people who don't match our normal way of thinking, who are not who are neurodiverse. So one good case is autism. Severe autism. My brother has severe autism. He doesn't speak. He never will speak. He will never be able to live by himself. He will never be able to have a romantic relationship or a friendship. That's like cancer. Be great to cure it.
Yeah.
But there are some people who have what's called autism, and it manifests itself in just a different way of thinking. In some way, possibly a better way of thinking.
Yeah, but Elon Musk has described himself as being on the spectrum, right? So this would be sort of the Asperger's zone.
That's right. And as you enter that zone, there's a certain, as you enter the zone, maybe the idea is, well, it's just another way of being. You should respect it.
And from an evolutionary psychology perspective, one could say that, well, some of this may have been selected for over time because it is useful to have some variety of brain types, arguably. I mean, one thing I've noticed having built a few businesses is, and I think there have been a bunch of studies to support that collections of people who have different personalities and different strengths are often better at solving problems or accomplishing things. Yeah. And I've found that if I've got a team of 12 people and we're trying to build a business, I have a brain that has a novelty bias. That's my generous description of some degree of ADHD, right? Yeah. It makes me extremely interested in new data, new ideas, new business models, new people. And that's useful. But I tell the people I work with, please feel free to say, Rufus, that's too many new ideas. Yeah. And I need your counterbalance, and we need people who really enjoy executing, routine, important, complicated, acts with consistency, who find that to be rewarding, which I don't find as rewarding, right? And you really need, in my experience, a half dozen different types of people to really build an organization that can accomplish all you want to accomplish. So to me, and this is obviously total armchair speculation, it's logical that, that you'd see some neurodiversity selected for.
I think that's one way to look at it. I think that's reasonable. Another take, which is consistent with what you said, is that it's not like there's a right level as to how anxious you should be or how depressed you should be, or how much your mind should wander, or how introverted you should be. It depends a lot on the context. Sure. I quote in a different part of the book the evolutionary psychologist, Nessie, and he's talking about anxiety. And he says, we talk a lot about people who have too much anxiety and they go to psychiatrists and they take medication. But we don't talk about people who have too little anxiety and they end up in morgues and prisons.
Right.
And so there's a right amount of how sad to be. And it's not nothing. It's not zero. Sadness exists for a purpose. There's a right amount of how anxious to be. There's a right amount of how social to be. And it depends on the context. People like Susan Cain point out correctly that this is, our society adores extroverts, but introverts have a certain power to them that manifests itself in different situations. So in general, the question is, I think I agree with the aspect of the neurodiversity movement, which says that we should work harder to respect differences, both in the way that you're talking about, which is, and Tyler Cowen makes the same claim in a book he wrote about talent and finding talent, which is often organizations work best when you have people with diverse ways of seeing the world. And then also it's just differences. People could flourish in different ways, even as individuals.
Yes. And it's interesting. One of the things that I've changed my mind about, and I'm increasingly looking for ways in which I change my own mind, because hopefully this is a sign that we're growing, learning, in the last couple of years, is because of conversations with Susan Cain and with Antonio Damasio and others, I've become much more appreciative of my funks, of my negative, experiences, which I used to think, I'm doing it wrong. right? I'm feeling down or discouraged or angry or frustrated or whatever it is. And this is a sign that I'm failing or doing it wrong. And I've come to see this as sort of feedback from the world and my own internal pattern recognition and response to the world, from which I can learn. Like I tend to follow. If I get in a certain sort of negative state of mind, the only thing that will make me feel better is working really hard. It's really immersing myself in my work, and maybe that's a signal that I need to be focused right now, right? I mean, or I feel guilty after a dinner party because of a comment I made, and maybe that's a sign that that I'm capable of insensitivity in certain modalities, right? So,
I like your use of the word feedback. There's an analogy here with physical pain. Nobody likes pain. Nobody likes pain. Almost by definition, you want to make pain go away. But if somebody was to strip away from you the ability to feel pain, your life, your life would be horrible. And if you're young and you start off that way, you may not live very long. Pain's a wonderful feedback system to say it's not good for your body to have your hand, over the flame. It's not good for your infected wound to just stay like that. It's not good if your arm is broken to swing it around. Pain tells you, protect that organ, pull away from the stove, and so on. Well, similarly, negative emotions serve that thing. If you didn't feel sadness when your mind is working right is saying you're messing up.
Yeah.
If you were perpetually cheerful, you wouldn't be talking to me today. You'd probably be just being cared for by other people because you never respond to your mistakes.
Well, and you point out that there's this arbitrary line we draw as to when a proclivity becomes a mental disorder. And so depression, you said something like more than 2 weeks of the of sense of depression or helplessness or whatever it is. And we say, okay, well, depression after the death of a spouse or a loved one is logical. And I think it's Johann Hari in his book, Lost Connections, who makes this fascinating case that if we think it's logical that someone's depressed for 3 months or 6 months after the death of a loved one, well, doesn't it make sense to be depressed if you're trapped in a horrible job or a horrible marriage? Here's this wonderful quote from Hari. Depression is, in fact, a form of grief for our own lives not being lived as they should, a form of grief for the connections we've lost, which is quite powerful. And I guess from that perspective, one could see an increase in incidences of depression at scale of a society as an indication that there's something wrong with that society, that maybe people are inadequately connected, or there's a collective grief.
Yeah, or equivalently, one could see gains in happiness over time in a society as showing opposite, which is things are going pretty well. Society's doing things right. No, I agree with that. I mean, I worry that sometimes what Hari misses in this is that two people can be in the same situation, and one can get horrifically depressed, and another one is resilient and shoulders through. And so you have to, in some ways, sometimes depression isn't the right reaction to it. Maybe sadness, but you should respond with resilience. The death of a child is a case where you'd expect everybody to become deeply, deeply filled with grief. But if you're living your life and you find it, you're filled with sadness because of the struggles of living your life, but it's actually, not a bad life, then maybe something's gone awry. Maybe an analogy is there are people with chronic pain, and they feel great pain, even though there's nothing that wrong with their bodies, but something is wrong with their brain that leads them to have great pain.
Well, when we think about how our understanding of human behavior has changed since the days of Freud and in recent decades, in the perennial nature versus nurture debates, how much is genes and how much is environment, it seems that the pendulum has swung in recent decades more towards nature. That genetics plays a larger role than maybe we once thought in determining our path. Would you say that's true?
Yeah. I mean, there's two questions about nature and nurture. One concerns universals, things we all have. So to what extent is our visual system or our capacity for language, our ability to walk, our ability to have short-term memories, to what extent is that shaped by our genes versus our environment? And here I'm kind of nativist. I think there's a lot of shaping force of our environment, but I think there's a fundamental human blueprint that is part of our nature that shows up. Then the other question is differences. So why are you more engaged with variety than I am? Why is one person more extroverted than another? Why is one person smarter than another? And so on. And there has been, I think for a long while in our history, people thought it was entirely environment. A very strong view is entirely environment. And there's been enough research suggesting that just as with the body, the brain is shaped to a significant degree by genes. So there's enough. If I wanted to know how extroverted you are, or how aggressive, or how clever, if I know the extroversion, aggressiveness, or cleverness of your biological mother and father, I could predict where you would be to some extent, even if they don't raise you, even if you're raised by other people. In the same way, I could predict to some extent your height.
Yeah. There's this fascinating data point that when you look at the big five personality traits of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeability, and neuroticism, that on average, apparently, women have higher levels of neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. It seems to me that at least 3 of those 4 are positive. Yeah. If you took a random person and gave them a personality test, you write, you'd have an 85% success rate at assessing whether that individual is a man or a woman. So that would support the sort of a genetic difference there.
Right. So there we get to group differences. And there's some evidence, and in fact, there's evidence that using these very broad personality scales underestimates the differences, the psychological differences, because extroversion, for instance, includes many things. And some of them are sort of many different things. If you zoom in and look at, say, scales of aggressiveness or risk-taking or nurturance, you actually get an even stronger predictive power.
Sure.
But again, I mean, one thing which is really critical to mention is we're talking about overlapping bell curves. And
yes.
And so there's 2 things that follow from it, which is say take height. Men are on average taller than women.
Yes.
To a certainly significant degree. But there's a lot of women who are taller than the average man, a lot of men who are shorter than the average woman. But the difference in overlap means at the extremes, you get a pretty strong sex ratio. So if you're looking at people, I don't know how the numbers at my fingertip, you're looking at people over 6'4". There's probably 1,000 to 1 ratio for men because just the difference is exaggerated. Similarly, men are somewhat more aggressive than women. But and this is not good for does not reflect nicely on men. If you look at people who are bizarrely, extremely, psychotically aggressive, they're far more likely to be men.
Yes. Right. Absolutely. Well, and when we look at the group differences, I love this little factoid. Liberals score higher on openness, looking at the big 5 personality traits. Conservatives score higher on conscientiousness. And you point out that these are both positive qualities.
It's nice to have a finding which everybody agrees on, as opposed to this group is stupid or this group
That's
is
right. I mean, probably most people would be like, okay, I'm conservative and I'm more conscientious than most liberals, or I'm liberal and I'm more open than most conservatives. Maybe everybody's happy with that outcome. Well, I was amused by this distinction between maximizers and satisficers, right? Maximizers seek out what's best. Satisficers go for what's good enough. And I think you said that in your marriage, there's a clear distinction. Yes.
This is the one bit of pop psychology which has slipped into my book, because this is a little bit of pop psychology. But I looked at the literature, and there is a literature on this, and this is a sort of a legitimate psychological difference, a way to categorize different people. Maximizers are people who will spend a long time scrutinizing a menu and picking up the best dish. Satisficers just glances and he says, I'll have this. Satisficers, they get in the car, there's a radio station playing, they listen. maximizers slow down and carefully turn the station until they get something exactly right. And I'm pretty much of a satisficer. I'm married to pretty much of a maximizer.
Yeah. Yeah. No, as soon as I read this passage, I handed the book to my wife.
And what is she and what are you?
And asked her, well, it's very clear to me that she's a maximizer and I'm a satisficer. So I feel your pain and joy and everything in between.
In some way, it means we're both free riders, because maximizers often work to make sure there's the best of everything. And they go through all the agonies determining this, while we go, just we don't care that much.
That's true. Yeah. Well, and you say maximizers tend to do better at life in objective ways, like getting better jobs, because they effectively have higher standards, and they're fighting for a more optimal outcome. But there's some evidence that they can be on average less happy. And you point out that I think it took your wife 6 months to select a desk chair, and this might be because they don't have a desk chair to sit on.
Yes. So she did find ultimately the best chair, but it took her a while. I would have just gone to IKEA and grabbed that chair and then just take it home.
Well, her delight with the desk chair she selected may offset the 6 months of crouching. My almost perfect wife, however, when she read the passage, said, "That's absolutely not true." She said, she's a maximizer in some ways, satisfies her in others. And she pointed out, and she's quite right about this, that when it comes to technology, the reverse is true. She'll have a 10-year-old laptop and an iPhone with a cracked screen, and it doesn't bother her. And she pointed out correctly that I'm a tech maximizer, right? So I don't know. This does feel to me like maybe in the category of a, as you say, pop psych that maybe could use more validation.
Like a lot of these things, I think that these human differences that we're talking about are useful approximations. But you're right. Often you need to zoom in, and it's more complicated. I often feel that way about the great personality contrast between introverts and extroverts, because it's not merely it's on a continuum. But it's also that I think it's just more complicated. So
yes.
For instance, I'll tell you about where I stand, which is I consider myself an introvert. Like if I'm at a party, I'll often go into the corner, or I'd much prefer talking to a single person. But I don't have any problem talking to a crowd of 1,000 people. So where does that put me? And it's complicated.
Right. And there's also this complicated question of to what extent people change over time.
Yes.
And the grant study, the Harvard longevity study that's been much cited, is I think one of a few studies that seems to show evidence that personalities do meaningfully change. And this is a question that I've wanted to pose to, and I will pose to our common friend Susan Cain, because I feel like in the 10 years that I've known her, I've seen her become a little less introverted, maybe.
Really?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think as you might say, she might say that public speaking is arguably a specific skill set that one develops a comfort with through exposure. But I guess I would describe, I'll say something much safer, which is that I would describe myself as someone who was introverted in my childhood and have become incrementally less introverted over the course of my life. And now anyone I say that to thinks it's hysterical that I would describe myself as introverted.
There's general changes in personality with age. I talk about it in my book. I forget the details. I think they're mostly for the good. If I remember it right, people become a bit less neurotic, a bit more agreeable, a bit more conscientious. And, I think I'm very hesitant to say one direction is better than another, but if I had to choose, I would go in that way. Also, one of the weird findings from our field is that the elderly are, on average, you got to be careful with this, but on average, happier than younger people.
Yes, wonderful finding, right? It offsets the creaky knees and any number of other indignities. Well, let's talk about IQ, right? Which is, a controversial topic, but also one on which there's a lot of data, and it's quite interesting section of the book. Do you want to tell us about your findings or the collective findings we have on IQ and how it impacts your life?
Sure, we know quite a bit about it. So IQ is your score on a certain test. what people are interested in is some sort of construct known as intelligence, which probably is a cluster of related things. And, the test is reasonably good at assessing people's intelligence. And one reason why we know that is that it correlates with so many good things. So people who have higher IQs, they make more money, they tend to be kinder, tend to be less racist, less sexist. They live longer. They're healthier. They do better at their job, whether their job is, as a scholar or working in the Coast Guard or just about anything. The military uses IQ tests because they really do have tremendous predictive power. And many people made the claim, and I think that there's some truth to that. If you had to know, if you're stuck and you had to know one number about a person to be able to predict their fate, their IQ would be the number to use. But there's an immediate qualification here, which I do make in the book, and I think it's important. I think it's often missed, which is to some extent the importance of IQ is a self-fulfilling prophecy set up by our society.
Yeah.
So I'm not denying that being smart is good. I think if you're a hunter-gatherer, it's better to be smart than less smart. But our society, United States in particular, say, really, really values intelligence. So what we do is we have universities, including elite universities. And to get into the elite universities, you have to score high on SATs and GREs and LSATs, which are basically IQ tests. And if you don't score high, then for the most part, it's a lot harder to get an elite university career. And for the most part, that means your life is less good. So in some way, IQ matters to such a degree because we set it up. We say, unless you have a high IQ, it's hard to get into Yale, Harvard, Princeton. And if you don't get Yale, Harvard, Princeton, you're not going to end up being the super elite in this country.
Right. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. On the list of effects or things correlated with high IQ, some of the more surprising ones, I was surprised by the kinder one. I would not necessarily have guessed that. But that people with higher IQ also exercise more and are less likely to smoke cigarettes. So it's clearly correlated with conscientiousness to some degree.
There might be some correlation with conscientiousness, with what Angela Duckworth calls grit. I think the kindness is because smart people can look out for can plan for the future in an intelligent way, which often involves being kind to people. Suppose I have to deal with you regularly, and I'm very tempted to cheat you, or defraud you, or just steal from you. But it's not in my future long-term interest. Just selfishly, it's better for me to keep dealing with you indefinitely, which requires treating you fairly and with respect. There's two ways I could falter. One is I could have low self-control, where all of a sudden, we're trading something and I just grab your stuff and run away with it because I can't resist. But the second way is I may not be smart enough to realize that I'm just shooting myself in the foot. And intelligent people are smart enough to realize that sometimes you have to defer some sort of, exploitation just because it works out for you better in the end.
Yeah, I love the notion that altruism and kindness are actually good life strategies, and that and to me this makes the case for rather than seeing sort of people who act in more selfish ways as acting out of self-interest, they're actually not acting out of self-interest well enough, right?
Yeah, that's right.
It's a better strategy to be kind, to be generous, and I think that from my perspective, that understanding can cause us to have less of a sense of sort of moral superiority, which liberals are sometimes guilty of, right? Which I think is kind of a dangerous tendency.
I think that's right. I think there's a lot of sources for altruism and kindness, and some of it really is a sort of abstract concern for others. I know there are cynical people who deny such a thing exists, but I think it does exist.
Yeah, absolutely.
But sometimes it is a sort of intelligent, self-interested thing where, certainly in a community, in a tight-knit community, in a society, in a corporation, having the reputation for kindness means people want to interact with you.
And how do you feel about Carol Dweck's growth mindset? And how much can we grow IQ? And we know there's been this Flynn effect that people have been getting smarter on average for up until maybe recently?
So there's sort of two questions here. One question is, Carol Dweck's work itself suggests that a belief that IQ is flexible and can change, or it's any sort of skill, is a good belief to have. It makes people persevere. They take on harder projects and everything. I know there's been work that has explored this, some of it critically, and maybe the effect, as always with psychology, maybe the effect isn't as big as it was originally reported, but it does seem to be an effect. She does seem to be, I think, right in this. The second claim is, can IQ actually go up and down? And I think to some extent it can. I think that certainly if your IQ, if your intelligence is hampered because you're living in an environment which is poisonous to you, or you're undereducated, or you're being treated savagely, you get huge jumps of IQ. Some of the studies find that to take a kid and who's raised in a terrible way and then put him or her into a good family causes a big jump. Moving us a bit older, there's a small IQ gain for each year you spend in university. Cynics might say that's just because you become better at taking the tests. But I think that there are environments that flourish IQ and environments that diminish it.
Yeah.
And not just IQ intelligence more generally.
Yeah. And I think this comment you made about the value of enriched environments, and I think you say in the book that the heritability of intelligence is higher for rich children than for poor children. Why? Because there's a bigger opportunity for kids who grow up in poor environments to benefit from more enriched environments and to maximize their genetic potential, in addition to taking advantage of whatever elasticity there is in cognition, right? And so this is yet another case for abolishing poverty, which we just discussed a couple of weeks ago with Matt Desmond.
I would be entirely in favor of abolishing poverty.
Yeah. But it's interesting as an observation that there's basically more upside in intelligence enrichment for kids who are growing up in environments that are with less resources.
It's in some sense it's a more general point. So the idea here is, suppose we live in a cruel society where half of the people, maybe the girls, don't get any math training, and unless you're part of a rich family, you have to spend all your time doing labor, and only the super rich get to go to schools and so on. There, the genes matter less for something like math because you could be a math genius genetically, but it won't show up if you have the bad luck to have the wrong skin color or the wrong gender. But you take a very affluent society, there the genes matter more.
Following up on our conversation about sort of neurodiversity, there's an open question, isn't there, about to what extent, or different people would maybe disagree about to what extent intelligence all aligns on the same axis of, like, if you're better at math, you're also better at understanding other people. For instance, is that true or is it not true? Versus this notion of having different kinds of intelligence. And my personal change of perspective in the last 30, 40 years has been in the direction of seeing more different kinds of intelligence, and having somewhat of a view that, let's say, to expand on that earlier point, that math skills and sort of emotional intelligence, or the ability to understand or empathize or connect with other people, don't strike me as being terribly correlated. So how do you think about, and one could say, if one believes that to be true, having a singular IQ test that everybody submitted to would do an injustice both to the employers who are using it to make decisions and to the people taking the test. So what do you think about that?
So the standard intelligence test is in some way a test of multiple intelligences, right? So they ask you about your math, and you have the vocabulary test and spatial rotation. And it makes sense. You might have imagined that, people who are good at math are bad at words. People who are good at space are bad at this. It turns out, though, maybe for interesting reasons, that there is a pretty high correlation between them. It's sort of like, a good analogy is athletic skills, right? So imagine we did a how fit are you tests. And so it involves how much can you bench press, how fast can you run, what yoga positions can you get into. And you could really imagine somebody being a really great marathoner, but can't lift very much or something like that.
Sure.
But
sure.
it would so happen if you gave that test to 10,000 people that on the whole, there'd be a correlation. A healthy, fit 21-year-old would do great at all of those things, or pretty good at all those things. A very sickly 90-year-old would do poorly at all of those things. And intelligence seems to be the same way, at least within the sort of parameters that are usually tested for an intelligence test. One of the big surprises is it's correlated. You're good at math. You're better than average at math. You're likely to be better than average at verbal skills. You're likely to be better at average at doing analogies or spatial relationships. Now, when you start looking at the sort of broader multiple intelligence thing, so, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, my understanding is there still exists a correlation, maybe not as large. But if you find somebody who has an IQ of, very standard IQ of very high, my bet is they'll probably be better than average on these other forms of intelligence.
Arthur C. Brooks wrote a piece for The Atlantic last week titled How Smart People Can Stop Being Miserable. I don't know if you saw that one. And he cited a 2010 study that concluded that there was no correlation among individuals in a given group between high IQ and higher levels of happiness. And this same study did show, however, that nations with, I think it was a meta study, a bunch of studies, that nations with higher average IQs do tend to have higher levels of happiness across the nation. But among individuals in a group, there was no correlation between high IQ and higher levels of happiness. Now, this to me is fascinating because I've chosen personally to define wisdom, which is sort of a blurry word, like what does it mean to be wise? My definition of wisdom is that it's the ability to apply intelligence to the task of increasing individual and collective happiness. Right?
Yeah.
And so if this study bears out, it would suggest that intelligence doesn't necessarily come with wisdom, right? I mean, that very bright people are not necessarily good at figuring out how to make themselves and people around them happy.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting. I think it's an empirical question. My bet would be that if you look closely, you would find a correlation between intelligence and happiness, just because intelligence correlates with all sorts of other things which themselves correlate with happiness.
Right, like money, which is another interesting topic.
That's
but
right.
That's right.
That's right.
So, I mean, if there was no correlation, you'd actually have to have an inverse relationship between intelligence and happiness because high IQ people make considerably more money, and we know that money has a positive impact.
That's exactly right. So it would be. I mean, you got to keep open to surprises. I hadn't heard of that study, and I'll check it out. It sounds interesting.
Coming up, we get to the bottom of the age-old question, does money make you happy? And if so, how much?
Well, let's talk about money and happiness, because I think this is, you point out that and by the way, I think I should say that it's just in the final chapter of the book that you give yourself permission to address a topic of great broad interest, which is, positive psychology, what makes us happy.
Yeah.
And maybe a little bit reluctantly, but you seem to enjoy writing that chapter too. But it is, so you point out that it's actually quite obvious that money would make people happy. We talk about it as if that's counterintuitive. And there's been some debate. I remember for years, everybody said, oh, well, having more money, having more income makes people happier up to $75,000 a year of income. And then it no longer has an effect. More recent studies have suggested, for better or for worse, the effect continues. Why do you think it's obvious that more money should make people happier?
Yeah, and I've been around long enough that I remember, to my embarrassment, lecturing intro psych students by saying, isn't it amazing that money doesn't make you happy? Because that's what the initial studies, which were not well done,
interesting.
found.
Okay.
But it's pretty clear it doesn't be amazing if it didn't. I mean, money can buy you time with your family and friends. Money could buy you medical care. Money could buy you better food, travel, freedom from dangerous circumstances, the ability to not to work in a degrading or dangerous job, in every possible way, differing across countries. So in some countries, money is essential to get medical care for you and the ones you love. Other countries have more of a safety net. But still, money matters. And so common sense is right. Better to make it a lot of money than a little bit of money. Common sense is also right in saying that there's diminishing returns. And this kind of makes sense too. If you make $50,000 a year and somebody offers you another $50,000, that's going to transform you. But if you're making $500,000 a year, it has less of an effect. There's some evidence that people who make like $2 million a year or up are happier than people who make $1 million a year or up, but it's not the biggest effect. So yeah, money is connected with happiness. I will say though, and this is something Dan Gilbert talks about a lot, that particularly at the high end, the difference isn't so much that you should give up other things. So the biggest connector to happiness, probably besides your genes, is social connectedness. Being with people you love, who respect you, who treat you kindly, who you have fun with. And you might be doing the math wrong if you make a healthy income and you decide to make a little bit more money, but spend it. But that keeps you busy so you don't spend time with friends and family. That might just be, from a purely hedonic point of view, a mistake.
Well, then you cite the surprising data point that people who believe they need money to be happy are less happy.
Yeah.
Right. Which you say, it sounds like you should inherit money or maybe make money accidentally. Like, how do we explain that?
I think the core finding here is that people who strive to become happy, the core finding, people who strive to become happy tend to be less happy on average. Now, I got to be a little bit cautious here because this is a sort of psych finding you can imagine going both ways. Maybe the striving makes you unhappy, which is a story I like to tell a little bit, and the authors of the work like to tell. But maybe people who are unhappy strive more. So it's kind of hard to pull apart. But regardless, it seems like there's a lovely study I summarize in the book, which looks at the happiest people in the world. So they look at people, there's these large scale studies, and look at people who are like 9 or 10 on a 10-point scale of how happy you are. All sorts of other scales. They're just blissing out. And so what are these people like? And what you see is it's everything. They're healthier. They exercise more. They're more curious. They do make more money, not a staggering amount more money, but they make more money. But mostly it's social connectedness. And so I feel that these people, it's not that they're spending all their time gritting their teeth making money, and nor are they spending all their time gritting their teeth saying, I got to be happier. These are people who just spend a lot of time with those they love. Yes,
indeed. And there's a lot of good news in the happiness data that giving makes people happy. That connecting with others, as you say, with family and friends seems to be really, like, if you had to name one, that would be the big one. And that might help explain why there's some poorer nations that have a lot less average household income than the United States, where people report higher levels of happiness. It probably has a lot to do with social connection.
It could be. The U.S. Punches a little bit below its weight for how much money it makes on a happiness scale. And there's a lot of debate over why this is the case.
I one of the most fascinating observations in your happiness chapter for me was this idea that happiness is not in fact a state, but rather it's a signal that our life is going as we would like it to. And I think you give the example of, and this sort of refers back to some of our earlier conversation, of a gas tank. It's nice to look at your dashboard and see that your gas tank is full. That makes you feel good. But if you had a broken gas gauge that always looks like it's full, well, that would be a delightful state.
That's right.
Until your car stops moving. So if we think about happiness as, this is another, threads back to the discussion of the utility of negative feedback. If we think of happiness not as itself the state that one wants to achieve, but rather it's a signal of whether we're doing things right, we might note that, hey, when we connect more with our loved ones and we're more generous and kind, that we're happier. If we learn from that signal, we will end up happier more of the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's the flip side of our discussion before about the utility of sadness, which is sadness, tells us,
Yes.
for the most part, when things aren't going well for us. And happiness is the positive flip side of things. So I think it's in some ways more complicated than that. I argue in my last book, and I wave at this in this last chapter, that I'm a motivational pluralist.
Yes,
So I think
yes.
there's more to life than being happy. There's also establishing meaning. There's being a good person. There's other things we might want besides happiness. But happiness is a fairly good indicator.
Yes. Well, and it's and I think part of the problem here is a semantic one, right? That it just feels inadequate as a word. It kind of sounds sugary, right? Like something I feel like we need a new word like umami for taste, right? We needed a new word to describe taste experience. And we need an umami, for happiness that captures some of the some layers of human satisfaction that are not simple. And this is in the direction of supporting the thesis of your last book, which is that we humans have motivational pluralism, right? That there's not a single thing that we want or aspire to, but a range of gratifying experiences.
I think that's right. I think that, and there it's not a psychological claim. I mean, this is more of a philosophical or moral claim. As a psychologist, I could ask, what makes you happy, and look at different influencers. But, moving outside that, we could also ask as people, is there more to life than being happy? And I think that there is.
Well, Paul, this conversation has made me happy. Thank you for taking some time out of your afternoon to be with us. Both The Sweet Spot and Psych, The Story of the Human Mind, are phenomenal reads, as are your prior books. And so I hope our listeners get a chance to enjoy them. And thank you again for being with us today.
Well, thank you. This has been a delight. I hope we have a chance to do this again.
Psych is out now in paperback. Pick up a copy at your favorite bookstore.
We also highly recommend Paul's Substack. It's called Small Potatoes, and you can find a link in the episode notes.
Caleb, I think I might read a review that was posted recently on Apple Podcasts. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
Here it goes. I'm just writing to thank you, Rufus, Caleb, and everyone else at The Next Big Idea for sharing so many powerful ideas in such a concise, digestible format. Okay, the concise part, you get credit for that, Caleb.
Thank you.
This podcast has changed my thinking and my life for better over and over again. Wow. I was listening to the episode about generosity. I realized now might be a good time to write a review. I love thinking about all the possibility in this world as we embrace generosity, becoming super communicators, think about drugs differently, and create atomic habits, to name just a few topics. So this is a attentive listener. Thank you. And he or she goes on to say, it does indeed feel good to share and write a review. Thank you for spreading such powerful, positive ideas to shape our future. I was really touched by this, Caleb.
Yeah.
I have to be honest, right? I mean,
I love that. That's why we do what we do.
It's why we do it. And I'm so glad that this, is having an impact for some folks. And I'm glad that it feels good to write a review, because that might cause other people to choose to write reviews if we're making a difference. And actually, you know what? In the spirit of generosity, Caleb, I want to thank you for partnering with me on this podcast. I just love doing it with you.
It's a blast, man. More to come. All right, well, let's close it out here. Today's episode was not edited by me, but it was mixed by the great Mike Toda.
We find it psychologically gratifying to work with the team at the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.